All right, everybody. We'll get started here in just about a couple of minutes. We'll let a few more people join up, and then we'll get rolling. Okay, I think we can go ahead and get started. Got a lot of good material to get through. Thank you everybody for joining today's webinar. We're going to be talking about increasing biodiversity through vegetation management across multiple application sites. My name's Chris. I do all the PR for Envu, integrated vegetation management, and I've got Gueth Braddock here, an Envu area sales manager. And I also have Rick Johnstone with IBM Partners, who has decades and decades of experience. So you guys are in for a treat with our special guest. So without further ado, Gueth, I'll let you take it away and we'll get underway. And sorry, Gueth, before you get started, if you guys have questions throughout the webinar that you'd like to ask at the end, just go ahead and put them in the chat anytime throughout the webinar. I'll be tracking. So if any questions pop up throughout the webinar or at the end, just put them in the chat and we'll ask our experts here. Go ahead, Gueth.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Rick, very much for joining us. And thank you for allowing me to talk to you today. We're talking about integrated vegetation management. We're talking about the industrial sites that we get to manage, like power lines, like pipelines, like backslopes on highways, railroad, solar farms, all those kind of things. And many of us have talked about this integrated vegetation management in forms of mechanical, chemical, and biological. And we're going to spend a good bit of time on the chemical and biological side, and using herbicides to get to that biological component that allows those early successional plants to be released. And many of these are found in the understory of forest that we have. Use of herbicide simulates a fire disturbance, and that leads to promoting plants that grow and provide that biological control for new seeds that hit the ground from the vegetation that's on the side of rights of ways. And these plants that we are trying to promote and release, they naturally compete with those new tree seeds hitting the ground, compete for water. So, which is a good thing. And plant succession is a natural process created by God, and it's based on where we're managing forest in the United States. In the East, there's about 90 different forest cover types that we have the opportunity to work with. Midwest is primarily rangeland. In the West, we have about 45 different cover types, forest cover types, including rangeland and desert. And that just depends on where you are in the U.S. of what kind of species that will be released. Just a couple examples quick before I turn it over to Rick, but this is one of our customers in South Mississippi, Cooperative Energy, and they have a tremendous success story. You may have seen that article published recently, but they've been on a program for about 20 years. They manage 30,000 acres of utility corridors, primarily transmission lines. And over time, they have moved that right away from a narrow corridor that runs from pole to pole to a managed right of way that's released these native species. And when they started, the gopher tortoise was a particularly important species they were trying to help increase and improve the habitat for. And that gopher tortoise simply used the place it could, which was that narrow path from pole to pole. And over the years, that 20-year period, they've widen that area of use, and now they've seen a 36% increase in tortoise presence and a 75% decrease in burrowing along that center line, which was the only place they had to use before. So one more example, and this is a 30-year program example, and it's just a good representation. This is electric co-op in Louisiana, distribution cooperative, but it's a great example of how herbicides and biological control can provide that diverse habitat. So A hectare of rainforest may have up to 300 tree species, and there are actually only 700 tree species in total in all of North America. If you consider a longleaf forest, which is one of the primary cover types where I am in Louisiana, 97% of that tree species is longleaf. However, in the understory, there can be up to 400 different plants in the ground cover, which is what Rick is going to talk about in great detail. So I'll turn it over to you now, Rick.
Okay, thanks, Gueth, Chris, and everyone who's on the webinar. It's my pleasure to be here and to work with you on this, and hopefully we can get some information across that everybody can understand what's going on across the country. Just a little bit of my background. I have a bachelor's degree in forestry from West Virginia University, and I worked for a number of utilities, primarily with Delmarva Power along the Chesapeake Bay. And I've worked with a lot of the industry experts on developing some of the basics of how we do our programs and working with the federal and state agencies and tribal nations. We've done documentation under IVM Partners on probably half the states in the union, worked with a number of different agencies, wildlife refuges, the Navajo Nation, and Santa Pueblo in New Mexico. But what I want to really concentrate on is how many right-of-ways we have. And, you know, there's a lot of different numbers that are bantered around, but the number of 60 million acres came from research at Purdue University that Dr. Harvey Holt headed up. And looking at all the rights-of-ways, electric, gas, highways, oil, and railroads, it's about 60 million acres. And that is actually larger than what we have in acreage of the national park system in the lower 48 states of the union. So it's a lot of land, and we crisscross every type of ecosystem that we have. Now, I want to touch base a little bit on how to get there, and starting off with the urban forest, where the utilities are going to be pruning. And I mentioned about degrading the forest and carbon because a couple years ago at the Trees and Utilities Conference, there were several utilities that had taken their foresters and put them in charge of coming up with zero carbon emissions by a year, 2030, 2035, whatever. And I made the point in a question and answer session, you could probably do more benefit on carbon by sequestering it if you manage the forest correctly. So I show this slide because some utilities are still not pruning properly. And so instead of the trees sequestering carbon, they're releasing it, especially when you take wooded sections that the utility will top, even though they have a right-of-way that they originally cleared. And then for sight distance, the highway department will come along and set their mowers on side, and then basically we're butchering the trees from the top and the side. So what I did when I was at Delmarva and what I show other utilities is reclaim your right-of-way back to its original boundary, what we would call wall trimming, and then keep it there with selective herbicide treatments so that we manage to low-growing compatible plants, grasses and forbs, wildflowers, and shrubs. Now, we mentioned mowing because everybody's used to mowing, whether you're on a electric highway, oil or gas pipelines, and nobody pays much attention to it. But if you are looking at carbon, this is one of the studies that were done at Gamelands 33 research site near Penn State University, that if you mow, you're going to release about 175 pounds of carbon per acre. So you have a 100-acre right-of-way, there's 9 tons of CO2 being released. And the other problems with mowing is if you take away all the vegetation and then we get one of these downpours in a thunderstorm that drops a couple inches, you're going to get erosion and you're going to get sedimentation into the streams. So you're going to affect the wildlife there. If you've taken away the riparian buffer, you're going to also raise the heat, particularly if you have salmon or trout. You can't afford to do that type. Wetlands, mowers are going to leave a lot of ruts. And the other thing is people say, well, we don't want any chemicals. And I go, well, go look into the wetland after a mower. And that picture on the right, you see the sheen, and that's the oil from the leakage of hydraulic fluid, fuel, and lubricating oil, because those mowers are being jostled around on those right of ways. And then when you get to the stream banks, a lot of times you'll run into an agency and say, well, you can use herbicides, but we want you to leave a 50-foot or 100-foot or whatever arbitrary buffer they want from the water. And I'm like, well, then you want to spread the invasive plants, because they like nothing better than to be growing near water so they could drop their seeds and then spread downstream. And when you cut, you've done nothing to the root system. All you're doing is cutting off the top. It's going to sprout back. It's going to form multiple sprouts. And so you compound your problem over time. We're not supposed to mow between April 15th and August 15th in the eastern part of the US. And that's because that's the migratory birds are nesting. So you don't want to destroy them. But turtles can't get out of the way of 3,000 RPM blades, and quail and turkey also can't get, their nests are going to be in those right-of-ways. Pollinators, people sometimes say, well, I'm not going to worry about the pollinators. But if you're managing a right-of-way, you better start worrying about them, because we have several species that have been listed. The rusty-patched bumblebee is listed as threatened and endangered. And the monarch butterfly most likely will be listed as a threatened species next month by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So if you take away habitat, you could be considered a taking, which can be subject to a fine from the federal government. Now, one of the things that we've worked on with IVM Partners, our botanist is Michael Robin Hagee. And he took a book that was written by Peter Littner at the University of Delaware called Garden Plants for Honeybees. And he extrapolated that to bombus, which is our native bumblebees, rather than honeybees, which are an agricultural product. But we look at what plant species are there, when do they flower, what percent cover, and then develop a rating of pollen and nectar value. And then also look at overwintering habitat so that they can nest. For our native bees, they're going to nest in the soil, or they're going to nest in dead stems like you would get from a herbicide application. We also use a lepidopteran metric, which is our moths and our butterflies. That was developed at the University of Delaware by Dr. Doug Tallamy's group, Kim Shropshire. And they have about 13 species showing what are the important plants that the monarch need, or not monarch, but all butterflies need for the for their larvae to feed on. Now, what got me interested in habitat restoration goes back to the beginning of my career in Maryland, when we treated a right-of-way, actually initially from the air and then touched up on the ground. And then we started getting white-fringed orchids popping up. And I called the Heritage Program in Annapolis, and I said, where are these things coming from? There was nothing here but maples, sweet gum, pine. And they said, well, we're finding out some of these plants can lie dormant up to 150 years. And it was usually fire, because the Native Americans used fire to drive game. So they burned the coastal plain on a regular basis. These plants need open meadows, and we, in our great wisdom and Smokey Bear, stopped burning. And so we have our wetlands are choked with vegetation. So this basically duplicated the effects of fire. That helped us come up with a partnership with the Heritage Program as well as the Nature Conservancy to protect other plants, such as the green pitcher plant and sundews. And again, they weren't in favor of herbicides until they saw how we could help them manage their vegetation. I thought, as the utility, I ought to try to get documentation, what is happening out there. But I figured if I did it from the utility, Delmarva is very environmentally sensitive. I said that people will not understand what's being done, and they'll figure that the utility is just trying to make themselves look good. So I went with a new group that formed, Chesapeake Wildlife Heritage, and our first research was at a nature center in Delaware. And it was basically the only herbaceous plant was Phragmites when we treated. And 2 years later, we had almost 60 species that germinated from the seed bank. Then when I started IVM Partners, we got a grant from National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, and we did the same type of documentation in the New Jersey Pinelands area in Cape May County. We took one span of transmission line and treated it and took out the Phragmites in the trees, and we released thousands of rose pogonia orchids, little tiny orchids. The only place they came in is where we herbicide treated. So I figured, there's so many things that could be in the soil that we don't know what we have. We should try to look at it. And we have an opportunity now because of a real opportunity on electric transmission because of the blackout in 2003 that was caused by trees, which led to the FERC regulations that are enforced by NERC, which are called FAC 003. And utilities, if they allow vegetation to encroach and cause an outage on a high voltage transmission line, they can be fined up to $1 million a day. So utilities got religion real quick and started clearing their right-of-ways back to their boundaries. And the best method coming from the research that Dr. Bramble and Burns did was to optimize the habitat by managing to low-growing species such as grasses and forbs under the wire zone where the conductors actually are, and then the border from the wire zone to the forest allow shrubs to come in. So you can have a two-tiered effect. The ANSI standard, which is a consensus standard between industry and the public agencies, is that for integrated vegetation management is what we should be doing to promote the compatible species and then manage those plants so we don't have the conflict. And they actually state that chemical methods should be used to transition the plant community to those sustainable compatible species, which then facilitates biological controls. Animals are going to feed on the seeds that drop in there, and plants compete with each other for sunlight, nutrients, and water. 40 years ago is when these studies came out from Bramble and Burns, and I incorporated those on Delmarva, and we took advantage of this and helped manage our right-of-ways in that fashion. Because it's a very environmentally sensitive area, we got a lot of pushback when we started. And I would tell the environmentalist, look, I'm a forester and I've had Lyme disease. And I know when I had Lyme disease, I had to take a very strong antibiotic to kick it out for 2 weeks. And then I don't take it anymore. I said, when you're really sick, you need something like that. But, if I got a headache, I might take an aspirin or an Advil or Tylenol or something. No difference. When you got an ecosystem that's sick, you need some good chemistry to get it back on its feet. So we have modern chemistry that can target certain plants. We have various application techniques. When you get rid of those weed species, which are a weed is any plant where you don't want it, then we have space for the desirable plants to come in and then keep them there. So because of the new FERC regulations, I started doing consulting when I left Delmarva Power about 20 years ago and helped ITC up in Michigan. And you see on the bottom left what it looked like. It was cleared, and then we did herbicide treatment, and you see the desirable vegetation coming in. One area that we took out, also herbicides that would take out spotted knapweed, which is the pink flower on the left on the right-hand side, the border zone, or outside the border zone, and Canada thistle. We started getting our native prairie grasses back, which again will also incorporate carbon into the root systems. But we also got quail. And I told the superintendent of the park, I said, well, I kicked out a covey of quail. And he said, where? And I said, where we sprayed herbicides. He said, we haven't had quail in 8 years. I said, you haven't had habitat. Build it and they'll come. Likewise, I did a presentation to Michigan Department of Natural Resources, and they had, I showed him this picture of this turtle. He says, where's that turtle at? And I said, in the Stony Creek Metro Park. He said, that's a rare Blandings turtle. He said, they need open meadows. And I said, well, they didn't have it, but they do after herbicides. So we also worked with Baltimore Gas and Electric with a number of agencies at the request of U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. When those right-of-ways were cleared, and everybody basically went ballistic from the Channel 2 news broadcast in Baltimore to the newspaper in Annapolis, they wanted BG&E to replant this right-of-way, and Fish and Wildlife said, "I know why you had to do it." He said, "But could you help us manage now?" So at their request, we came in and we did broadcast treatments on the upland areas with herbicides that would take out the trees and release the native prairie, which you see in the picture on the right. There's milkweed and there's goldenrod. And then in the border zones and in the ravines, we did selective backpack treatments to retain the shrubs. They asked if we would help to get rid of the invasive Phragmites in the wetlands. We took care of that and then brought back our native wetland plants, and then basically took that from being cut to native prairie and shrubs. Then we put on a workshop. We had the US EPA up from Washington because it's only 40 miles away, and Fish and Wildlife and the US Geological Survey experts participated in the training. Sam Droege is the bee expert for the US, and he told the participants, "You're standing in probably the best bee habitat in the mid-Atlantic states." It was only 2 years after we made that transition. But they also, Fish and Wildlife worked with Audubon and documented 120 species of birds, including the forest interior dwelling species, what they call FIDs. Fish and Wildlife, Rich Mason said, they nest in the forest, but they come into the right-of-way to get food for their young. Young chicks can't eat seeds, but they need fats and carbohydrates, and that is the caterpillars they'll get in the right-of-way. They also documented 147 species of native bees, 40 species of lepidopterans. And I worked with Sam Droege on a committee, and we helped the North American Pollinator Protection Campaign put together a brochure on rights-of-ways, and this is one of the things available on our website. The Maryland Public Service Commission also participated in that workshop, and they now require IVM if a new transmission line is built in the state of Maryland, which we ended up working with one that was bringing wind power out of Pennsylvania into the grid into Maryland. The Patuxent Wildlife Refuge, when they saw what was possible, they said, "Could you do it here, but don't mow it first because mowers masticate everything. Could you do it in another way?" So we equipped tractors with a Radiarc sprayer and elevated it so we could kind of duplicate what a helicopter would do when we're not going to be flying a helicopter along the BW Parkway and next to Fort Meade. So we did it from the ground. But we show you starting at the bottom when we had all the trees and the autumn olive bushes, and we did a broadcast treatment. Then we went to selective hydraulic to selective backpack. And here's how that plant community changed over time. So depending on what you do, you're going to get more or less of what you want and what you don't want. Notice, though, the red are the incompatible, the trees and the invasives. You will never completely eradicate them because seeds are always falling in from other areas. So you have to stay on top of your work. But when you look at what the effect is on bees and butterflies, it's a tenfold increase in habitat simply by doing selective IVM work. Now, in a community, I always say that the ringleader is a little old lady in tennis shoes, and that was Elaine. And her husband had worked with the agencies and said, if they can do work and improve it in a wildlife refuge, why can't they do it in our community of Columbia, Maryland, which is a bedroom community of Washington, D.C. Now, people were used to it being mowed twice a year, but when BG&E had to clear the trees in the wetland area where the trees had grown up to get in compliance with FERC, well, people didn't want that either. So we put on a workshop and said, we're going to do ecosystem restoration. And as of October 1st of that particular year, we said we're going to be spraying herbicides and no longer cutting. And on the far right, you see how it ended up. But this is the transition. Here's the wetland. The bottom picture is the guy with the backpack, and then on the right is how it came out. There's a gas pipeline crossing. Again, when it was cut, treated in 2010, then you see the following year, and 5 years later, you see all that habitat. So we took a mowed right away, turned it into a restored ecosystem to the benefit of the pollinators. Now, other animals are going to use this. You've got raptors. They patrol and those right-of-ways because that's where their food is going to be. You have a multitude of different mammals that are going to use these right-of-ways. So it's not just pollinators or birds. But when we do this type of work, the other thing we need to get across to the public is human beings have to do this work. We've got to get in there to do it. And these mountain areas are particularly hard to access, as well as the swamps down where Gueth is in Louisiana. But you're not mowing these areas, you're hand cutting. This is very dangerous work, especially when you got snow and ice on the ground. And some of our agencies misuse the what they call the NEPA program, which is National Environmental Policy Act, where they won't let us do anything unless we jump through a bunch of hoops. And working with Public Service New Mexico, the Santa Fe National Forest would not allow any herbicides. So we had to go through great lengths just to get the vegetation recut. But I told them, you've got Gamble oak and you've got pinyon pines. They are going to sprout. You're not going to take them all the way down. So you get them sprouting, but you also, in high elevation, you got the oak. Low elevation, you got juniper. You're in that high desert type of climate. Things do not biodegrade very quickly like they would in the east because we don't have the moisture. Then you have issues with pine bark beetles with the ponderosa pine. All you need is a lightning strike, and then you've got wildfire. And so we need to also manage our right-of-ways to help prevent wildfires, because it's not just what you hear out west. In California, they got big problems with invasive grasses, cheatgrass and some other grasses. In the east, Maryland and New Jersey, we have a huge problem with phragmites. And the states have basically given up. But if we get a nor'easter without rain, which we get occasionally, and it's blowing 40 miles an hour, and we get a fire in phragmites, we've got some serious trouble, like they did in Hawaii. They have buffalo grass. And the problem in Hawaii, they had a hurricane that was south of the islands that took all the moisture, and then brought wind with no rain. So 80-mile-an-hour winds drove those fires into Lahaina and killed 101 people. So we have chemistry that'll take out these plants. There's a new one in Indaziflam that Bayer developed that Envu now markets. And we could take out the cheatgrass, and we did a study in Colorado, one application, and all the native stuff came back. And this is what it looks like on a whole landscape scale. But not only that, if you're looking at carbon, if you have our native plants, they're going to store the carbon versus if you have something like cheatgrass. And this, I did consulting with Maui last year, and it's pretty troubling when you come into Lahaina and you see all the signs and pictures of the 101 people that died in that fire. But they have buffalo grass, but they haven't been controlling the grasses and making good fire breaks. So in Arizona, we work with Arizona Public Service, and they couldn't use herbicides back then in Prescott National Forest. So we used the forest as our control area and private rangeland as our treatment area. And we wanted to show them we can manage a right-of-way to low, cool-burning plants that provide a fire break and also provide access for the hotshot crews to be brought in to then backfire and stop one of these wildfires. We've also worked with the tribal nations. At the request of APS, we worked with the Navajo Nation, and they ended up giving their EPA clean water section, gave us a grant to help restore grasses for grazing, because that's their main source of income, cattle and sheep grazing. And but so we controlled sagebrush and allowed more grasses to come in, and then the washes where we had salt cedar and Russian olive, we took care of that and brought back native plants such as Rocky Mountain bee plant. And again, we did workshops for them and Bureau of Indian Affairs. Now, the ANSI standard is what we should be using everywhere. The agencies should allow the utilities to do the right IVM techniques without expensive environmental assessments. We have a high energy demand right now, AI centers, data centers. We need to rebuild our infrastructure. We need to use the best practices. This is a huge opportunity to do a number of things, from increasing pollinator habitat to storing carbon. And here's an example where a public agency originally would not let a utility do IVM until they understood what we were going to do. This was with Columbia Gas, and at that time it was under NiSource. And the right-of-way in 2006 was completely overgrown. They would have to hand cut it. And they said, well, the Army Corps won't let us use any herbicides. So I met with them and I went over what we needed to do. And they said, well, this sounds like a good opportunity to improve wildlife habitat. We manage 30,000 acres. It'll help us. And I said, well, what did they want to do, the gas company that you said no to? They said, well, they wanted to use a helicopter and they wanted to use the herbicide Tordon, picloram. And I said, well, I would have told them no. I said, this is a recreational reservoir. You have a lot of people boating and camping here. You'd have a lot of complaints because this brush is tall and you don't get much snow and ice in Nashville, Tennessee. I said, but the other thing is that herbicide is not registered for water. You'll get problems, and you have sinkholes in this area. I said, but we have the right tools. Let us do it. And they gave us the blessing. So we came in, we mowed it first in the winter, then we did an ATV broadcast, and then followed up with backpack crews. And this is the first time I worked with Progressive Solutions, because Lee Atkins was at a meeting with me and he said, if you need any help, let me know. And I said, I want to touch up this area. And he said, you pay for the chemical and I'll bring you some crews. And we did. And then you see how it was managed and how it's come about. This same right of way is where we developed the pipe zone, border zone for gas and oil pipelines. And that's now part of the ANSI standard. I had asked Lee, develop a backpack that'll spray from behind so the worker could just walk along where the pylon is that marks where the actual pipe is, and develop grass in that zone. And then we do selective treatments in the border zone to have the pollinator and wildlife habitat. Now, IVM also means you don't sleep on your laurels. You get a right of way under control, you've got to keep it under control. Like I said, things are going to seed in. In 2021, Robin's in the back with an orange vest on. We're documenting the plant community. And I said, you need to cut down the red cedar because the herbicide wasn't effective on them. So come in and hand cut them and windrow them, get them off the right of way, and go ahead and do some treatments. Well, they did the cutting, but they didn't do any treatments. And we came back this year and it was pretty overgrown. So they retreated this year, but you can't just sit back. It's much easier if you keep it under control, and it's much more economical, which you see here with Enable Midstream Natural Gas down in Arkansas. When we got that under control, got them on a 3-year treatment, and you see the difference between what they were spending on mowing and what they needed to spend for selective treatments. So they're saving about $500,000 a year on their pipelines. When you deal with other agencies like heritage programs, I showed what happened with Maryland, but that was a long time ago. And they needed the education. In Arkansas, Enable Midstream proposed herbicide treatment in a wetland where they had a rare corkwood shrub, and Heritage said no. Well, I gave a presentation in Little Rock, and the head of Heritage was there, Theo Witzel, and he said, well, let's go out there together. So we looked at it, and I said, and the utility wanted to spray, and I said, no, it's too tall. You're going to get collateral damage. This corkwood shrub is only 4 feet high. Mow it in this winter and then come back next year, which you see on the right, and do your selective treatments. But I want to show you how it changed. The corkwood was 10% of where we did our study, 10% of the plant community. When it was mowed, it dropped to 6% because that next year everything can come up and you get other plants dominating. And then we did a herbicide treatment, it jumped to 22%. And then we did a touch-up treatment 2 years later, and it jumped to 35%. So if they only mowed like they had been doing, they'd have a boom and bust, 10%, 6%, 10%, 6%. With IVM, they got a 350% increase in the population. We also worked with them in Oklahoma, where they had what we call an orphanage right away, where they took over a pipeline that hadn't been worked in years. And I said, just mow everything down and mulch it. Let's see what we get. Then we came in with backpacks, and you see in 2 years later, we had native prairie back and nothing was planted. Now, if you do new construction, you do have to do some planting for erosion control. But we worked with TransCanada, TC Energy in West Virginia, in north central West Virginia, in a wildlife management area with partnership with West Virginia DNR. We documented what was there prior to the pipeline being built, and then we followed it being built. And to give you an idea how hard it is to get that shale gas, this is taking it from Ohio all the way down to Houston. But in that center picture, the backhoe is being held up by 3 bulldozers chained to it so it doesn't roll down the mountain. So we looked at where we did conventional grass seeding and other areas where it's grass and forb combination, and then showed how that can be restored. And they were normally going to mow it, but we said it's too steep to mow. The tractors, it's a 45-degree slope. On the left, Robin is down at the bottom. You can barely see him. And I'm standing on the right next to sycamore trees that have sprouted 3 years after it was cut. So when you have those streams, they're bringing seeds, and that stuff can grow very quickly. So the riparian areas needed backpack treatments to, again, manage those. And where you do need to do plantings, trying to encourage the utilities as well as the agencies. Don't use aggressive plants such as orchard grass, Sericea lespedeza. They keep our native stuff out, and they're not very good habitat to start with. So we're saying, and this is the research we did with TC Energy, plant compatible grass in the pipe zone where we're going to want it, and then forbs in the border zone. It's kind of taken what Stephen Covey said in his book, 7 Habits of Highly Successful People. Begin with the end in mind. Start off doing what you want it to end up being, so that we end up with pollinator habitat as well as good access for our maintenance. Now, we started doing some work for Piedmont Natural Gas in North Carolina. We looked at it in 2022, and then it was treated in 23, and then show you how it came out in 24. We wanted to treat this past year, but if you recall, Western North Carolina got wiped out by that hurricane, and they were spending most of their money reburying pipes. But we also did studies in Charlotte along a greenway where we could show the public what we're doing. And again, the public was coming by as we were documenting, as our botanist is documenting, and they asked, well, what are you guys doing? And I explained it to them, and they said, I was wondering why they always mow. I thought there'd be a better way. This sounds like a good way to do it. And when you look at how it's changing, they have a big problem with porcelain berry and trees. We're knocking that back with one application. Another application will get it on its way. Now, I started working with highway departments when I was at Delmarva at the request of Delaware DOT. And they said, could you help us? We're seeing you have habitat on your right-of-ways. We'd like to get it on the highways. Well, one of the things we're finding, if you drive around, simply because the state owns all the way back to the fence, 250 feet back, they don't need to mow all the way back there. They need to mow next to the highway. And in Oklahoma, when we were doing our studies on that pipeline, first week of September, we were there, and they were mowing everything back to the edge. And I'm like, what are the monarchs supposed to eat to try to fly back to Mexico? They need asters in the fall or blooming, such as goldenrod. So yeah, the milkweed is important for the larva monarchs, but nectar and pollen is what they need to make the trip back home. Now, if you're going to plant, do it at a rest stop so you could have a kiosk and explain to the public what you're doing, because it's very expensive. On the highway, we work with University of Maryland. They were going to plant to do some studies with Maryland DOT. This is between Frederick, Maryland and Gettysburg. I said, why don't you stop mowing? Let's see what we get. 51 species germinated. Then we brought in trained crews and did selective treatment, took out the trees and the invasives, and you see all the milkweed coming in on the right. We also worked here in, this is near St. Michael's, Maryland, working with Chop Tank Electric and the DOT. And instead of mowing all the way back, the crews go down and we show them not only what we want you to treat, but what we want you to not treat to make sure we keep our good habitat. Another site in Maryland, I said, just stop mowing. Let's see what we get. We got our milkweed came in. We have our native prairie grass coming in. In Florida, we did a study in Lake City, Florida. They didn't even have to treat it. And they said they have to mow multiple times there. And I'm like, you only need to mow right by the highway. They're saving $500 per acre per year not mowing. Alabama DOT, we said, give us a half a mile. Let us show you what we can do. So we started in 2015. This is going around a beltway around Talladega. And we said, you need to mow zone 1. Zone 2 is your swale. Zone 3 is your back slope. That's where we taught the backpack crews. One application, 21 more species germinated. And then we came back and touched up 3 years later. I was pleased to see this year in Tennessee that their DOT on I-40, they only mowing that zone 1 and their back slope is all in pollinator habitat naturally. Now we have a lot of push for other types of energy. These are windmills with Apex Clean Energy down in coastal plain of North Carolina. We're coming from the baseline. What was in that forest before they cut it to put the turbines in? And this is a Weyerhaeuser pine plantation. So we said just seed in something to hold the soil. So we used Virginia wild oats. And then transmission line, it's flat. I said, it's not going anywhere. Don't be putting a lot of stuff in. Let's see what we get naturally. And here, this case here on the left is February of this year, and on the right is August. 58 different species germinated. Same thing along the roads. Allow the native stuff to come back in. So when you're looking at managing, you know, they have the crane walk. The cranes need to get in to bring in turbines. So if they have to replace blades, we may have to work on those. They have the electric lines that tie all those turbines together. And then where they bring the turbine blades in, if it's going around a bend on a road, they need to manage those turn areas for the radius of that turbine is going to swing out. So those areas need to be managed. In Virginia, we've documented baseline and a solar array site that's being built, and then also wind turbines in Virginia. And most of them are, 14, 16 species in the forest. Here is the radii for the wind turbine in Virginia. 49 species germinated in the spring. We came back this fall to see what we had, and it was nothing but burnweed. American burnweed comes in after a fire or a broadcast herbicide treatment that takes out everything. So somebody else did the treatment because it wasn't it wasn't Apex or their contractor. So we're only assuming it was probably the county roads who sprayed it. So we're going to compare that against another site farther down. We went ahead and documented that because nobody had sprayed it, and there's 79 species. So we'll see what comes in 2026. This year we did work with Canadian Pacific Kansas City Railroad. This is outside of Kansas City. Jeff that works for them had heard me speak in Niagara Falls a few years ago and said, could you help us? We want to try to get biodiversity. So instead of spraying everything on the rail lines, we're going to be doing selective treatments there, as well as the terminals where they take things from the rail to the trucks and back and forth. So we're documenting what's there now, and then they have a big problem in the Kansas City area with amber honeysuckle. Some of these sites, it's 40% honeysuckle. So a lot of these invasives give off their own herbicides, the allelopathic chemicals. So if we can get rid of them, we should be able to bring back our natives. And these are some of the things that are there that we want to try to release and be able to manage for. So there's a number of other areas that we should stop mowing, like inner cities. They want to have habitat. Stop mowing, let's see what we get. We did one site in Baltimore, we got milkweed the next year. Golf courses mow the rough every year. We did selective treatments here in Queenstown. We did another site in Patriots Glen Golf Course in Elkton, Maryland. And then the farms, they mow these ditches, both for agriculture, and that fence is for a solar site. We did selective treatments, and you can manage all of this acreage for habitat. So to kind of sum up, if you mow and hand cut, you can maintain vegetation, but you can't manage. You spread the invasive plants, you decrease biodiversity. The invasive grasses are what's fueling the wildfires. If you do mow, do it in the dormant season. Don't do it when insects need that nectar. Selective herbicides should follow the mowing after one growing season. Allow that dormant seed bank to germinate. Don't put a lot of things in unless you have to. The germinating plants provide for the pollinators. Milkweed will come in naturally. We don't need to spend money planting it. The plants and animals provide the biological control. They reduce the cost over time. The prairie plants will sequester the carbon. And these right-of-ways are good links for wildlife corridors. So I'll leave it for any questions for myself or Gueth.
Hey, Rick, thanks so much. That was a ton of great information. I don't see any questions in the chat just yet, so I'll go ahead and start you off. So for companies who are considering switching to a targeted herbicide application or rotation, and this could be for Gueth or Rick, whoever wants to take it, what would be the best place to start? It's obviously a daunting task, but where would be the best place to start integrating those herbicide applications into their vegetation management plan?
Well, I'll jump in on it first. Just if you're mowing a right of way now, then plan on having that be your first areas to then treat next year. It's very difficult to start managing when it's overgrown. Now we've done it. You can do it, which we did at the Patuxent Wildlife Refuge. But most places, it's easier if you cut things down and then come back the next year when everything sprouts back, and then start it from there. And I'll give it over to see what Gueth has to say on it.
I would say the exact same thing, Rick. You don't have to turn the entire system over, in one pass. You just follow up whatever mechanical maintenance you did and start small. And if it takes you 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 years to turn the whole system around, then you can start managing it long term. So I agree. And another big thing is if you're going to start a herbicide program, before you go out there with some kind of prescription, identify what you have, your top 2, 3, 4 species, match that to the species that are listed on the product label, and that'll give you your best chance of success.
Great, thank you both. A reminder, if you all have any questions, just go ahead and put it in the chat, and we'll try to get to it before we finished. Oh, we just got one through from Cindy. What's the best way to go about evaluating species? We have a robust IVM program, but would love to measure it.
Well, the best way that we've done, at least right now, is actually have a botanist. And when we've done all these documentations that I've shown you, as I'll come out on the right of way and I'll take an area that's representative of 90% of what that utility is having to deal with. You don't want to take someplace that's off the wall. But we usually take an upland area and a wetland area and then replicate it. And it doesn't have to be huge. And we might do 10 by 30 meters. And then our botanist, Robin, he'll document everything in there. And not only document what type of plants, what's the percent cover, and then again we separate them by what we're targeting, what we want to keep, and then see how that goes going forward. I would suspect as we get better with AI, we should have the technology for a drone or something with a camera to take an infrared or ultraviolet, some type of a different spectrum to measure and be able to have a signature of different plants and be able to tell you what's there with just a look over. I would hope we get to that point, but I think that that's something that could come down the pike.
I got another question for you guys. As we inch closer to the official listing of the monarch, what do you believe to be the greatest impact this listing will have on state DOTs and utilities that are in the butterfly's migratory path?
I think the biggest impact is going to be that they have to be cognizant of the fact that they either have habitat or could have habitat. And some of the practices they do, like I showed the mowing, unnecessary mowing at the wrong time of the year, those types of practices they need to cease. They need to be cognizant of what they have out there and what potential they have. And areas that they could provide habitat, I don't think Fish and Wildlife will start off demanding anything like that, but I think as they go forward, there's no reason why they can't be managing zone 2 and 3, which is the swale and the back slope for pollinator habitat, which will include the monarch. There's no need for them to mow all the way back, and do it at the right time of the year. The other thing is not always to be planting trees. I see that in Maryland where they have, a goal of planting 5 million trees, and they're making the highway department plant trees on that back slope. And I'm like, you're making them spend money we don't need to be spent. There's nothing wrong with having our prairie back. We got less than 1% of what we used to have.
Thank you, Rick. Got another one for you. What's the approximate annual budget for the restoration for some of these entities after woody control hits 90%?
Well, your cost, if you look at what your cost for mowing, your cost for the herbicide application is going to be about the same as what you're mowing it for, if not less. What will cost a little bit more at the beginning is if you're mowing on, let's say you're on a 4-year mowing cycle, you're going to mow it and then come back the next year and do the first herbicide treatment, then come back. And I usually recommend coming back within 2 years and do a follow-up treatment, because you're never going to get 100%. Something's going to not be hit. And then once you get it under control, at least east of the Mississippi, the mid-Atlantic South, you're going to be on about a 3-year cycle. You can't really go much longer than that. You saw what I showed in Tennessee. If they went to 5 years, it's too long. But then it's going to be not as intense as it was the first time, because you don't have as much to do. And every time you come back, there's less to treat, because your desirable species are managing it for you. You're getting your biological control. So initially, you're going to have a little bit of an input at the beginning until you can get on that 3-year cycle. Gueth, I don't know if you have any other thoughts on that process.
No, I agree. I was just going to offer one comment about electric utility line clearance. It's the big expensive item is the mechanical side, and that's side trimming, mowing, cutting trees down, those kind of things. But using herbicides to maintain that floor significantly reduces that mechanical cycle cost the next time you come around, because those tree contractors are not having to spend a lot of their time and resources doing something with the floor, like fence rows and things like that can be easily managed with herbicides. So you have a great reduction on the mechanical costs to that program as well.
There's other areas where you're going to save as well. And going from a background with electric, the high voltage electric transmission, if you manage it correctly, when I showed the slides of what we did on Delmarva 40 years ago, we had the grass lanes, which normally we would have as the wire zone, but we actually did them because we had a lot of wetlands, and we would make sure that we put grass or manage for grass on the best route for a line crew to be able to get back there to do emergency repairs, so that if you have an outage from a hurricane or an ice storm or something like that, you've got lanes there for your line crews to be able to get in and quickly repair that system and get it back working. So there's other benefits you get from managing that's not just if you take a straight cost comparison between what's it cost to cut versus manage. Like I said, there's a little increase when you first start it, but the benefits going forward to manage a system far outweigh of what would happen if you just mowed it and then you came back a year or two afterwards. You might have to mow it to be able to get a crew in there to do your repairs. And that adds not only the cost of service, but public relations with your customers, because nothing worse than people being out of power. Just they don't take it very well.
Rick, I think you touched on this at multiple parts of your presentation, but could you just offer some advice or maybe some tips on dealing with federal regulations, state regulations, regulatory bodies who may restrict the use of herbicides when companies may want to come in and start an application rotation?
I'd say the first thing is start a dialogue with them. One of the reasons that I wanted to form IVM Partners is I was part of a team with Edison Electric Institute meeting with all the federal agencies in DC, trying to come up with what would be an ANSI standard, a national standard. And we weren't getting anywhere. And I found out that the only time we would talk to each other is if we needed a permit for something or we did something wrong, and then they were coming after us. But on a day-to-day basis, EPA, Fish and Wildlife, Park Service, BLM, Army Corps had no idea what we were doing. So one of the things that when we first formed IVM Partners, we did a workshop with cooperation from DuPont and in Chesapeake Farms in Maryland, where we had a workshop. We showed them what we were doing. We showed them how we did it. And EPA came to me and said, we really want to thank you because, we have to approve these things and we have to decide what you guys do, but we never see what you actually do. No one ever invites us out there. So I would say have dialogue with them, like we had with the Army Corps of Engineers, explain what we're doing, why we're doing it, what are the products we're going to use, what are the techniques we're going to use. So I'd say first for the utility foresters, know your tools, know what you're trying to do. There's plenty of information out there. We have plenty of conferences. Learn from others that have done it and then take that forward. But you don't have to reinvent the wheel. There's enough information out there, especially with now that we have an ANSI standard and we have a lot of things in writings. I'd be happy to help. That's why we have the website. We have examples on there. There's videos. There's enough to go with, but I'd say the dialogue with the agencies, treat them with respect. They have their job to do. You have a job to do, and show that if you cooperate, we can improve on a lot of things for both of us. It makes our job easier. It makes their job easier.
Great. And I think we're just about out of time here. But I'll put contact information for both Gueth and Rick up here on the screen. Reach out with any further questions. I think they're both happy to help with anything you need. Thank you everybody again for tuning in with us today, and we will be back in the new year with another webinar with some more experts and expertise. So thank you everybody.
All right, thanks everybody.
Thank you.